They called him the Fool of Oak Haven. When Samuel poured his life savings into a grey, cracked wasteland that hadn't grown a single weed in a decade, the entire town laughed. But 90 days later, the laughter died. What erupted from that dead dirt changed American farming forever. The air inside the Mercer County Grange Hall smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and impending bankruptcy. It was early March, and the annual foreclosure auction was underway. Most of the local agricultural heavyweights were in attendance, leaning against the folding tables, waiting for prime grazing land or highly sought-after riverfront acreage to hit the block. In the back row sat Samuel Croft. At 48, Samuel looked like a man who had weathered one too many storms without an umbrella. His hands were calloused, his jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and his eyes carried a quiet, calculating intensity. He didn't belong to the local good old boys club. Until 2 years ago, Samuel had been a senior soil agronomist for a massive corporate firm in Chicago. That was before he whistle-blew on a proprietary synthetic fungicide that was systematically destroying soil microbiology across the Midwest. He won the moral victory, but the corporate retaliation had cost him his career, his reputation, and his marriage. Now he was down to a cashier's check for $15,000, his entire remaining net worth. Next up, Lot 88, droned Davis, the weary auctioneer, adjusting his reading glasses. 52 acres off County Road 9, formerly known as the Bennett Tract. Opening bid is $10,000. A collective scoff rippled through the hall. Lot 88 wasn't just bad land. It was legendary for being completely, irreparably dead. 20 years prior, a subsidiary of the chemical giant Omnichem Agricultural had leased the Bennett Tract as a testing ground for experimental defoliants and high-yield synthetic fertilizers. When the company finally packed up and left, they abandoned a desolate, poisoned moonscape. The topsoil was stripped. The ground was baked into a hard grey crust, compacted so tightly that a tractor's tiller would simply bounce off it. Even the resilient local thistle refused to take root. The locals called it the Brimstone Tract. 10,000, Davis repeated, scanning the room. Do I hear 10,000 for 52 acres? Richard Lawson, Oak Haven's wealthiest farmer, let out a booming laugh. Lawson owned 4,000 acres of prime, genetically modified corn and sorrel. He drove a pristine, climate-controlled John Deere 9RX and treated farming more like an industrial assembly line than a relationship with the earth. Davis, you couldn't pay me 10,000 to take that toxic parking lot, Lawson shouted, earning a chorus of chuckles from the surrounding men. Only a complete idiot would throw a dime at that chalk dust. In the back row, Samuel raised his numbered paddle. 10,000! The laughter in the hall snapped shut. Every head swiveled to the back. Lawson narrowed his eyes, chewing on a toothpick, sizing up the stranger. 10,000 bid by the gentleman in the back, Davis said, slightly bewildered. Do I hear 11? Silence hung heavy in the room. No one was going to counterbid. They were too busy staring at Samuel, as if he had just volunteered to buy a sinking ship. Going once, going twice, sold. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Samuel Croft was now the proud owner of the worst piece of real estate in the Pacific Northwest. As Samuel made his way to the front to exchange his cashier's check for the deed, Lawson deliberately stepped into his path, blocking the aisle. Lawson was a towering man, exuding the smug confidence of someone who had never failed. You ain't from around here, buddy, Lawson said, looking Samuel up and down. So maybe you didn't know. That dirt is dead. The pH is sitting north of 9. It's got a salt concentration that would pickle a cucumber in an hour. You just bought yourself an expensive cemetery. I read the geological surveys, Mr. Lawson, Samuel replied evenly, keeping his voice low. The dirt isn't dead. It's just dormant. Lawson snorted, stepping aside. Dormant. Right. I give you a month before you're out here begging me to buy it off you for pennies on the dollar just to escape the property taxes. Good luck, Dirt Doctor. An hour later, Samuel drove his sputtering 1998 Ford F-150 out to County Road 9. He pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out, boots crunching on the brittle earth. It was worse than the photographs. The land stretched out in a depressing expanse of cracked, pale grey earth. There were no birds. There were no insects. He walked to the center of the acreage and dropped to one knee. Pulling a heavy steel trowel from his belt, he drove it into the ground. A jarring vibration shot up his arm as the metal struck the surface. He barely managed to chip away a quarter-inch of dust. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the recent soil analysis he had commissioned from Midwest laboratories. The numbers were catastrophic. Organic matter, 0.1%. Compaction severe. Microbiological activity undetectable. Any conventional farmer looking at those numbers would immediately order hundreds of tons of mined gypsum synthetic nitrogen and massive industrial rippers to physically tear the earth apart. They would try to force the land into submission through brute mechanical and chemical force. But Samuel knew something they didn't. He knew that forcing the land was what killed it in the first place. You don't perform surgery on a starving patient with a chainsaw. You put them on an IV drip. Samuel picked up a handful of the grey dust. It slipped through his fingers like dry ash. It was hydrophobic. If it rained right now, the water would simply bead up and roll away, taking what little loose soil remained with it. All right, Samuel whispered to the empty, desolate fields. Let's wake you up. The town of Oak Haven kept a close eye on the brimstone tract over the next 30 days, waiting for the inevitable arrival of heavy machinery. Lawson and his cronies placed bets at Dixon's Grill on how soon the new guy would give up. But the expected fleet of bulldozers and deep-ripping tractors never arrived. Instead, Samuel brought garbage. It started in the second week. Samuel drove his battered Ford to the local coastal fisheries in Astoria, returning with a bed full of fish carcasses, scales, and crab shells. The next day, he negotiated a deal with a nearby lumber mill, hauling away trailer loads of discarded hardwood sawdust and bark that they were planning to incinerate. Finally, he visited a dairy farm that was facing fines for excess manure runoff, offering to haul away their oldest, most degraded waste for free. To the outside observer, Samuel was turning Lot 88 into a landfill. To Samuel, he was gathering the ingredients for an ancient, almost forgotten alchemy. His first major project looked like absolute madness to the passing cars on County Road 9. Samuel dug long, shallow trenches across the property. He filled them with the wood waste and set it on fire. But rather than letting it burn to ash, he carefully smothered the flames with a layer of dirt and water, just as the wood turned to glowing coals. He was creating biochar, a highly porous carbon structure that acts as a microscopic housing complex for bacteria and fungi. Thick white smoke billowed from the farm for 3 days. It didn't take long for the complaints to roll in. On a damp Tuesday morning, a crisp white county vehicle pulled onto the property. Out stepped Harrison Cole, the regional inspector for the Agricultural Bureau. Cole was a rigid bureaucrat who viewed farming solely through the lens of compliance, chemical manifests, and tidy rows. Cole pinched his nose as he walked toward Samuel, who was currently standing over a bubbling 1,000-gallon intermediate bulk container IBC tote. The smell radiating from the tank was a pungent, earthy mix of a brewery and a deep swamp. "Mr. Croft," Cole barked, waving away a fly. "I've received 6 complaints about noxious odors and unregulated burning. What exactly is going on here? Where are your chemical storage manifests?" Samuel wiped his hands on a rag, turning off the air compressor that was feeding oxygen into the bubbling tank. "No chemicals, Mr. Cole. I'm brewing a microbial tea. Jadam and Korean natural farming methods. It's an aerated compost solution." Cole peered suspiciously into the dark brown liquid. "Looks like a biosecurity hazard. The county has strict nuisance ordinances, Croft. Lawson tells me you're running a glorified dump out here. You can't just pile raw fish waste and burnt wood on alkaline soil and call it farming. If you don't have an approved remediation plan on file by Friday, I'm issuing a cease and desist." "The plan is in the tank, Inspector," Samuel said calmly. He didn't explain the painstaking process he had undergone the week prior. He hadn't told anyone how he hiked miles into the pristine old-growth forests of the nearby Whispering Pines State Reserve. There, beneath ancient oak trees, untouched by human hands, he had buried wooden cedar boxes filled with half-cooked rice. He left them for days to collect indigenous microorganisms, IMO, the microscopic, invisible workforce of nature. He had cultivated those wild native fungi and bacteria, bringing them back to his farm to multiply them by the trillions in this very tank, feeding them complex sugars and humic acids. Cole sneered. "Friday, Croft, or I lock the gate." Undeterred, Samuel worked through the nights. He attached a spray boom to a small, rusting ATV and drove back and forth across the 50 acres in the moonlight. He wasn't spraying herbicides. He was inoculating the dead dirt with liquid life. He sprayed the microbial tea directly onto the biochar, spreading the fish emulsion and fungi over the grey dust. Then came the seeds. He didn't plant corn or wheat. He broadcasted a bizarre cover crop mix, deep-rooted tillage radishes, often called daikon crimson clover, and drought-resistant sorghum. When Lawson drove by and saw Samuel tossing seeds onto the cracked, unbroken, concrete-like soil, he actually stopped his truck just to laugh. "You're throwing good seed on a brick patio, Croft. The birds are going to eat half of it, and the sun will bake the rest. You haven't even tilled the earth." "The roots will do the tilling, Richard," Samuel replied, not stopping his steady, rhythmic pacing. Lawson shook his head, rolling up his window. Delusional. But the real test came in the 6th week. A bizarre, unseasonal weather front stalled over the Willamette Valley. The meteorologists warned of a massive sudden deluge, a bomb cyclone of rain. For a normal farm, this was a blessing. For the Brimstone Tract, it was a death sentence. With a severely sloped topography and soil that was completely hydrophobic and heavily compacted, 50 acres of heavy rain had nowhere to go but sideways. Lawson and the neighboring farmers immediately began sandbagging their lower irrigation ditches, fully expecting Samuel's entire top layer of loose dustfish rot and biochar to liquefy and wash across the county roads in a toxic, muddy tidal wave. The storm hit at midnight. Rain slammed down in sheets, an aggressive, relentless hammering that lasted for 8 terrifying hours. At dawn, the rain stopped, leaving a heavy, cold mist over the valley. Harrison Cole's county truck, followed closely by Lawson in his heavy-duty pickup, sped down County Road 9. They were armed with eviction paperwork, environmental fine citations, and the smug satisfaction of being proven right. They expected to find the road washed out. They expected to find Samuel ruined. They skidded to a halt at the boundary line of Lot 88. Cole stepped out of his truck, his clipboard in hand, ready to deliver the final blow. Lawson climbed out behind him, a smirk plastered across his face. But as they looked out over the acreage, the smirk vanished from Lawson's face. Cole's clipboard dropped to his side. There was no mudslide. There was no washed-out road. The water hadn't run off. It had vanished. Lawson rushed to the fence line, staring in absolute disbelief. The grey, concrete-like surface was gone. Instead, the ground was covered in a soft, dark, vibrating fuzz. The trillions of microscopic fungal threads, the mycorrhizal networks Samuel had brewed and sprayed, had webbed across the surface, holding the soil together like a microscopic chain-link fence. More incredibly poking through the crust were millions of tiny, aggressive green shoots. The radishes, fueled by the microbial explosion that had suddenly broken down the locked-up nutrients in the soil, the taproots were acting like biological jackhammers, driving straight down into the compacted clay, opening channels for the rain to sink deep into the earth. For the first time in 20 years, the Brimstone Tract had inhaled a storm, and it was breathing. By week 6, the Brimstone Tract was no longer a barren, grey parking lot. It was a vibrant, chaotic jungle of crimson clover, towering sorghum, and massive leafy radishes. The transformation was so violent and abrupt that cars frequently slowed down on County Road 9 just to stare. The deep-rooted daikon radishes, some as thick as a man's forearm, had fractured the impenetrable hardpan beneath the surface. They acted as biological drills, shattering the compacted clay and creating massive channels for oxygen and water to finally reach the suffocating subsoil. But the real magic was happening where no human eye could see it. The soil was alive. Samuel Croft spent his mornings on his hands and knees, gently digging into the earth. The dirt no longer smelled like sterile chalk. It radiated the rich, intoxicating scent of geosmin, the unmistakable perfume of active, thriving soil bacteria. When he pulled up a handful of earth, it didn't slip through his fingers like dust. It clumped together in dark, cottage cheese-like aggregates, bound tightly by glomalin, a sticky protein produced by the mycorrhizal fungi he had brewed in his vats. He even found his first earthworm, a thick, writhing night-crawler that had somehow migrated from the roadside ditches, drawn by the sudden explosion of subterranean food. While Samuel watched his soil breathe, Richard Lawson watched his own empire begin to crack. Lawson's massive 4,000-acre operation was built on a fragile, chemically dependent illusion. His genetically modified corn required massive amounts of synthetic nitrogen, which in turn required massive amounts of water to prevent the salts from burning the plant roots. But the spring had been unusually dry following the singular bomb cyclone. Worse, Lawson's deep irrigation wells were beginning to pull up silt. The aquifer beneath Oakhaven was dropping fast. There was only one place in the county where the water table was actively recharging, and it was directly beneath Lot 88. Lawson sat in his sprawling air-conditioned farm office, staring at a geological hydrology map. The Brimstone Tract sat perfectly atop a natural subterranean basin. For 2 decades, the compacted dead soil had acted like a concrete lid, forcing all rainwater to run off into the county drainage ditches. But Samuel had broken the lid. The 50 acres were now acting like a massive sponge, funneling millions of gallons of rainwater straight down into the basin. If Lawson could foreclose on Samuel or force him to sell, he could sink a high-capacity industrial pump right in the center of Lot 88 and save his failing cornfields. Lawson picked up his phone and dialed Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a local contractor who did Lawson's dirty work, hauling unpermitted waste, intimidating immigrant laborers, and handling the problems that Lawson's corporate partners didn't want on their ledgers. "Arthur," Lawson growled into the receiver. "Croft's weed patch is getting out of hand. It's a biosecurity threat to my purebred seed lines. I want you to go out there tonight. Take the ATV with the boom sprayer. Load it with pure, undiluted paraquat. I want a 100-foot dead zone along his northern border. When the county sees he can't control his borders, they'll hit him with containment fines he can't pay." That night, under the cover of a new moon, Arthur Pendleton cut the barbed wire on the northern edge of the Brimstone Tract. The air was thick with the hum of crickets from Samuel's field, a stark contrast to the eerie chemical silence of Lawson's adjoining corn rows. Arthur fired up his ATV, the high-pressure nozzles hissing as they unleashed a toxic mist of industrial herbicide. Paraquat was brutally efficient. It destroyed plant cell membranes on contact. Arthur drove parallel to the property line, smiling as the sharp, chemical stench filled the air. He was halfway down the fence line when a blinding spotlight snapped on, hitting him squarely in the face. Arthur slammed on the brakes, shielding his eyes. Standing 30 yards away, bathed in the harsh white light, was Samuel Croft. He wasn't holding a shotgun or a pitchfork. He was holding a high-definition video camera mounted on a tripod. "You're trespassing, Mr. Pendleton." Samuel's voice rang out, amplified by a small megaphone. "And you are illegally discharging a restricted-use neurotoxin. The EPA Environmental Crimes Division is going to be very interested in this footage." Panic seized Arthur. He shoved the ATV into reverse, tearing up the soil as he retreated back onto Lawson's property, abandoning the severed wire and fleeing into the darkness. Samuel lowered the megaphone, his expression grim. He walked over to the blast zone. The smell of the chemical was nauseating. By tomorrow, 100-foot strip of his beautiful, thriving cover crop would be dead burned to a crisp by the poison. Most men would have called the sheriff, filed a lawsuit, and spent the next 3 years tied up in court while their farm failed. Samuel didn't have 3 years. He had exactly 3 weeks until his primary planting window closed. He needed to heal the chemical burn, and he needed to do it immediately. He returned to his brewing tanks. This time, he didn't brew a general bacterial tea. He specifically isolated and multiplied strains of Pseudomonas and white rot fungi microorganisms uniquely capable of breaking down complex synthetic hydrocarbons. He spent the next 48 hours drenching the poisoned strip with his specialized biological brew, aggressively flushing the toxins from the soil matrix and breaking the chemical bonds of the paraquat. When Lawson drove by 3 days later, expecting to see a withered, dead border, he nearly drove his truck into a ditch. The clover had wilted slightly, but the sorghum was standing tall, pushing out new, aggressive green shoots. The soil hadn't died. The microscopic army Samuel had built simply ate the poison and asked for more. Lawson pounded his fist against his steering wheel, his face flushed with rage. The sabotage had failed, and the real test, the brutal summer heat, was about to begin. By the end of June, exactly 90 days after the county auction, the Willamette Valley was hit by a punishing, relentless heat dome. Temperatures soared into the triple digits and stayed there. The sky turned a pale, hazy blue, completely devoid of clouds. Across Oak Haven, the conventional farms began to collapse. Lawson's pristine rows of genetically modified corn, heavily reliant on constant irrigation, began to curl and turn a sickly pale yellow. The bare, tilled soil between his rows baked in the sun, reaching surface temperatures of 140 degrees. The heat literally sterilized the top 2 inches of Lawson's dirt, vaporizing the moisture and killing whatever faint trace of biological life remained. His massive pivot sprinklers ran 24 hours a day, but the water evaporated almost as fast as it hit the hot dirt. On Lot 88, Samuel was ready for his final act. He didn't bring in a plow to tear up his towering cover crop. Instead, he rented a heavy water-filled roller crimper and drove it slowly over the 50 acres. The heavy chevron blades of the crimper didn't cut the plants. They snapped the stems at the base, laying the massive volume of green biomass flat against the earth. In a single afternoon, Samuel transformed his vertical jungle into a horizontal armor-plated blanket of thick mulch. Beneath this dense layer of crushed vegetation, the soil was completely shaded from the blistering sun. The moisture was trapped. The surface temperature of Samuel's soil was a cool, damp 75 degrees. Using a specialized no-till planter, Samuel sliced narrow slits directly through the thick mulch and planted his cash crop, an extremely rare, highly lucrative heirloom variety of Oaxacan green dent corn, intercropped with nitrogen-fixing runner beans and broadleaf squash. It was the ancient Three Sisters method, supercharged by modern biological science. July gave way to August, and the drought worsened. The town of Oak Haven watched in stunned silence as a clear, impossible dividing line appeared on County Road 9. On the right side of the road, Lawson's empire was dying. The corn was stunted brown and rattling in the dry wind. His primary well finally sucked air, the pump whining in agony before burning out completely. On the left side of the road, the Brimstone tract was an explosion of deep emerald green. Samuel's heirloom corn shot up toward the sky, the stalks thick and vibrant, heavily laden with massive ears of green-kerneled cobs. The broad squash leaves completely shaded the ground, creating a humid, thriving microclimate. He hadn't irrigated once. The deep roots of the terminated radishes had left hollow tubes in the soil, allowing the roots of his corn to dive 8 feet deep, effortlessly tapping into the recharged water table below. The climax arrived on a sweltering Tuesday morning. Harrison Cole returned to the property, but this time he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by Dr. William Harrington, the regional director of the USDA Soil Health Division, and a small entourage of agricultural journalists. Word of the Brimstone miracle had reached the state capital. Lawson, seeing the official vehicles parked at Samuel's gate, sped over in his truck, desperate to find out what was happening. Samuel met the delegation at the edge of the field. Dr. Harrington, a distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carried a heavy steel soil probe. "Mr. Croft," Dr. Harrington said, shaking Samuel's dirt-stained hand, "I've seen the satellite thermal imaging. Your property is registering 20 degrees cooler than the surrounding acreage. Do you mind if we pull a core?" "Be my guest," Samuel said, gesturing toward the dense canopy of corn and squash. Dr. Harrington stepped into the field. He brushed aside the thick layer of decomposing mulch and drove the steel probe deep into the earth. It slid in effortlessly, slicing through the ground like a hot knife through butter. He pulled the probe out and laid the 3-foot core sample on the tailgate of his truck. The crowd gasped. The dirt was pitch black, holding the rich moisture of a freshly baked chocolate cake. It was teeming with white fungal threads and wriggling earthworms. Dr. Harrington poured a vial of hydrogen peroxide onto the soil. It instantly bubbled and foamed furiously, the undeniable chemical reaction of explosive, massive biological life. "Incredible," Dr. Harrington whispered. "Organic matter is at least 5%. You've built topsoil in 90 days that takes nature 1,000 years to create. Mr. Croft, the carbon sequestration metrics here are staggering. The federal grants you qualify for alone will make you a very wealthy man." Lawson pushed his way to the front of the group, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer desperation. "Croft," Lawson stammered, his usual arrogance completely shattered. "My wells are dry. The bank is calling my loans next week. I'll buy it. I'll buy lot 88. 50,000. 100,000. Just name your price." Samuel looked at the man who had mocked him, threatened him, and tried to poison his land. He didn't gloat. He just looked tired but deeply satisfied. "The land isn't for sale, Richard," Samuel said quietly, "but I'm not going to watch this town starve. If you're willing to park that tractor, sell off your chemical sprayers, and Actually listen to the dirt. I'll teach you how to bring your farm back to life." Lawson stared at the black living soil on the tailgate, then back at his own dying brown fields across the road. The fight drained out of him. Slowly, the wealthiest man in Oakhaven removed his hat and nodded. The fool of Oakhaven hadn't just saved a piece of dead dirt. He had saved the entire town. Samuel's journey proves that no matter how damaged the earth or our own lives might seem, nature always holds the power to heal if we just give it the right tools. True wealth isn't built by forcing the world to submit. It's built by working in harmony with the life beneath our feet. If this story of incredible resilience and the magic of soil regeneration inspired you, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Let's spread the word that miracles are possible, one seed at a time.